Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Sit back, relax, and let history take you somewhere far away. April the 25th, 1986. Ukraine. The northern part of the country, close to the border with Belarus, in the flat and forested land that the Ukrainians call Polisia, the land of forests, a region of marshes and rivers and pine trees that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, interrupted only occasionally by small towns and collective farms and the particular infrastructure of Soviet rural life. The unpaved roads, the wooden houses with their carved window frames, the Orthodox churches that had survived the Soviet decades in various states of preservation and neglect, the fields that in late April were beginning to show the first green of the spring planting. In this landscape, on the bank of the Pripyat River, where it runs broad and slow through the Plesian plain, there was a city that had not existed 30 years before. The city was called Pripyat. It had been built beginning in 1970 to house the workers and families of a nuclear power station that was being constructed 4 kilometers to its south, a station that would become, when it was completed, one of the largest nuclear power installations in the Soviet Union, and one of the most modern and one of the most celebrated examples of Soviet technological achievement in the post-war decades. The station was called the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin Nuclear Power Plant. Most people called it simply Chernobyl, after the small town that had existed in the area before the station was built, the town that gave the surrounding district its name. Pripyat, in April of 1986, was a city of approximately 49,000 people. It was, by the standards of Soviet urban planning, a relatively pleasant place, not beautiful in any conventional sense, not distinguished architecturally, but clean and functional in the manner that Soviet new towns of the 1970s aspired to be, with wide boulevards and apartment blocks set back from tree-lined streets, a central square with a hotel and a cinema, and a culture palace, a fairground whose Ferris wheel had been installed just days before and had not yet been used, schools and hospitals and the shops and facilities that 49,000 people required for daily life. The average age of Pripyat's residents was 26. It was, by design, a young city, populated primarily by the engineers and technicians and operators and support staff who kept the nuclear station running, and by their families, and the youth of the city gave it an energy and a social life that many Soviet cities of the period lacked. The nuclear station itself employed approximately 14,000 people across its various shifts and departments. It consisted of 4 operating reactors, numbered in the Soviet fashion from 1 to 4, of the type known as the RBMK-1000, a designation that stood for Reactor Bolshoi Moshchnosti Kanalny, which translated roughly as High Power Channel Type Reactor. The RBMK was a Soviet design, developed entirely within the Soviet nuclear program, without reference to the Western reactor designs that dominated nuclear power generation elsewhere in the world, and it had characteristics that distinguished it from those Western designs in ways that were, at the time of Chernobyl's construction, regarded by the Soviet nuclear establishment as advantages rather than liabilities. The RBMK was large, very large by the standards of nuclear reactors. Its core was a cylinder of graphite approximately 7 meters tall and 12 meters in diameter, containing over 1,000 individual fuel channels, each holding 2 fuel assemblies of enriched uranium, each cooled by water that was pumped through the channel and allowed to boil as it absorbed the heat of the fission reaction, the resulting steam-driving turbines that generated the electricity that was the plant's purpose. The reactor could produce up to 3,300 megawatts of thermal power, enough to generate approximately 1,000 megawatts of electricity, enough to supply a city of several 100,000 people with all the electricity it required. The RBMK had, by April of 1986, been operating in various installations across the Soviet Union for more than a decade, and it was regarded by the Soviet nuclear establishment with a confidence that, in retrospect, was not entirely warranted. The reactor had had incidents, a partial fuel melt at Leningrad in 1975, various other operational problems at various installations, but these had been managed within the classification system of the Soviet state, their details restricted to the people who needed to know them and not shared more widely, either within the Soviet nuclear industry or with the international nuclear community. The RBMK's operators and designers, and the officials who oversaw them, had built up, across those years of operation, a picture of the reactor's behavior that was based on incomplete information and that contained, as a result, a significant error. An error about one of the reactor's fundamental physical properties, an error whose consequences would be demonstrated in the most unambiguous possible way in the early hours of April the 26th. But on the afternoon of April the 25th, none of this had happened yet. The reactor that would be at the center of the coming catastrophe was reactor number 4, the newest of Chernobyl's 4 operating units, having come online in December of 1983 and been in full commercial operation for just over 2 years. It was, by all the metrics that the Soviet nuclear industry used to assess its plants, performing well. Its output was steady, its safety systems were functioning as designed, its operators were experienced and qualified. There was, in the afternoon of April the 25th, no reason to expect that anything unusual would happen. The unusual thing that was about to happen had its origin not in any malfunction or mechanical failure, but in a test. A safety test, specifically, a test of a safety system, of a particular backup power system that was designed to provide emergency cooling water to the reactor's core in the event of a sudden loss of main power. The test had been planned for months. It was, in the theory of its designers, a routine engineering exercise of the kind that nuclear power plants conducted periodically as part of their safety certification program. It would go catastrophically wrong. To understand why it would go wrong, it is necessary to understand something about the nature of nuclear reactors, and about the specific nature of the RBMK, and about the specific test that was being planned, and about the specific chain of decisions and circumstances that would carry the test from its planned beginning to its unplanned end. A nuclear reactor generates heat by sustaining a controlled fission chain reaction in enriched uranium fuel. Uranium atoms, when struck by neutrons, split, this is fission, releasing energy in the form of heat and releasing additional neutrons that strike other uranium atoms and cause them to split in turn, generating more heat and more neutrons in a self-sustaining chain. The chain reaction is controlled by inserting materials that absorb neutrons, control rods, in the standard reactor design, into the reactor core. When the control rods are inserted, they absorb neutrons and reduce the rate of the chain reaction. When they are withdrawn, the chain reaction accelerates. The operator of a nuclear reactor controls the reactor's power output by adjusting the depth to which the control rods are inserted into the core. In most Western reactor designs of the 1980s, the coolant water that circulated through the core served a dual purpose. It carried heat away from the fuel, which was its primary function, and it also moderated the neutrons, slowing them down from the high speeds at which they were produced by fission to the lower speeds at which they were most effective at causing further fission. In a reactor with water as both coolant and moderator, the loss of coolant water, whether through a pipe break or a pump failure or any other mechanism, had an automatically stabilizing effect on the reactor's power output. Less water meant less moderation, which meant the chain reaction slowed, which meant less heat was produced, which meant the remaining water was less likely to boil away. This was a safety feature built into the physics of the reactor's design. The RBMK used graphite as its moderator. The graphite was the solid material that formed the reactor's core, the large cylinder in which the fuel channels were embedded, and it performed the moderation function independently of the coolant water. In the RBMK, the cooling water's role was purely to carry heat away from the fuel. This meant that the loss of cooling water in the RBMK did not have the automatically stabilizing effect that it had in water-moderated reactors. Instead, in certain operating conditions, the loss of cooling water had the opposite effect. As the water boiled away and was replaced by steam, the steam absorbed fewer neutrons than the water had, which left more neutrons available to cause fission, which caused the reactor's power output to increase rather than decrease. This characteristic, the tendency of the reactor's power output to increase when the cooling water began to boil, was called the positive void coefficient. It was a known property of the RBMK design. It had been identified by Soviet nuclear physicists. It was not a secret, in the sense that it appeared in classified technical documents that were available to the relevant experts. It was, however, a property whose significance was systematically understated, in the training provided to RBMK operators, in the operating instructions that governed the reactor's use, and in the assessments provided to Soviet regulatory authorities. because acknowledging its full significance would have required acknowledging that the RBMK had a fundamental safety problem, and acknowledging that would have been inconvenient for the Soviet nuclear program, which had built and was continuing to build a large number of RBMK reactors. The positive void coefficient was not by itself necessarily fatal. The RBMK had control rods, 211 of them, that could be inserted into the core to shut down the reactor in an emergency. If the reactor began to run away, the operators could insert the control rods and bring the reaction to a halt. The control rods were the last line of defense. The control rods of the RBMK had a design feature that had been identified as potentially problematic in an internal Soviet safety review in 1983. The control rods were made of a neutron-absorbing material, boron, but they had graphite tips. When a control rod was withdrawn from the reactor core, the graphite tip was positioned at the bottom of the fuel channel. When the operator commanded the rod to be inserted, as part of an emergency shutdown for example, the rod moved down into the core, but for the first few seconds of its travel, the graphite tip entered the fuel channels before the boron section did. Graphite moderates neutrons rather than absorbing them. The result was that, in the first few seconds after an emergency rod insertion was commanded, the control rods briefly increased the reactor's power output in the lower portion of the core before the boron sections reached the zone of maximum reactivity and began to absorb neutrons and reduce power. This was known. It appeared in the 1983 safety review. The appropriate response was to modify the control rod design, to replace the graphite tips with neutron-absorbing material, or to redesign the rods so that the graphite sections did not enter the active zone of the core during an emergency insertion. This modification had been recommended. It had not been implemented. It was, in April of 1986, still on the list of planned improvements that had not yet been made. The test that was scheduled for the night of April the 25th and 26th was designed to address a specific safety concern about the RBMK's emergency core cooling system. In the event of a sudden loss of main power, a blackout for example, the reactor's cooling pumps would need electricity to continue operating. The diesel generators that were available as backup power sources took approximately 60 to 75 seconds to reach full operating capacity from a cold start. During those 60 to 75 seconds, the cooling pumps would be running on the residual rotational energy of the turbines as they coasted down from full speed. The turbines had enormous spinning masses, and as they slowed, they continued to generate some electricity, though a diminishing amount. The question the test was designed to answer was whether this residual turbine energy was sufficient to power the cooling pumps through the gap between main power loss and diesel generator startup. The test had been attempted 3 times before, in 1982, in 1984, and in 1985, and had failed to produce a satisfactory result each time for various reasons. In 1982, the turbine had not performed as expected. In 1984, the result had been inconclusive. In 1985, a test had been conducted, but the instrumentation had been inadequate. The test scheduled for 1986 was the 4th attempt, using modified turbine equipment and improved instrumentation, and the expectation was that this time it would produce the definitive result that the safety certification program required. The test required the reactor to be operating at a reduced power level, between 700 and 1000 megawatts thermal, roughly a quarter to a third of its full output, because at full power the turbine rundown would not accurately simulate the conditions of an actual power loss. The reactor would be brought down to this reduced power level. Certain safety systems would be temporarily disabled as part of the test protocol. The turbine would be disconnected from the main power grid and allowed to coast, and the test instrumentation would record whether the coasting turbine generated enough electricity to maintain the cooling pumps at the required level. The test was scheduled to begin on the afternoon of April the 25th, during a planned maintenance shutdown of reactor number 4. The reactor had been running at full power in the preceding days, and the plan was to reduce its power gradually during the day of the 25th, reach the test power level in the afternoon, conduct the test, and then continue with the shutdown. The man who was in charge of the electrical test, the engineer responsible for the turbine equipment and the instrumentation, was Anatoly Dyatlov. Dyatlov was 51 years old, a nuclear engineer with extensive experience in submarine reactor programs before his transfer to Chernobyl, where he had risen to the position of Deputy Chief Engineer for Operations. He was known at the plant as a demanding and sometimes difficult supervisor. Intelligent, technically competent, absolutely certain of his own judgments, and intolerant of those who disagreed with them. He had a reputation for pressuring subordinates to meet production targets and schedule commitments, and for dismissing safety concerns that he regarded as excessive or unfounded. Several people who worked with him later described him as a man who was very difficult to argue with, not because his arguments were always correct, but because of the force and certainty with which he presented them, and the implicit professional consequences that challenging him seemed to carry. On the afternoon of April the 25th, the power reduction in reactor number 4 was proceeding as planned. The reactor's output was being brought down gradually from its full level of 3,200 megawatts thermal in preparation for the test. The shift responsible for the initial power reduction was the day shift, headed by a shift foreman named Yuri Tregub. The actual test was expected to occur later in the day, under the supervision of the next shift. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, with the reactor's power reduced to approximately 1,600 megawatts thermal, the Kiev grid controller called the plant. The grid controller was responsible for managing the electrical supply to Kiev and the surrounding region, and he had a problem. 2 other power plants that normally supplied Kiev were experiencing difficulties, and the grid needed Chernobyl's reactor number 4 to continue supplying power at its current level for longer than had been planned. Could the test be delayed? The plant agreed. The test was postponed. This postponement, which seemed at the time to be a routine logistical adjustment, would have consequences that its participants could not have anticipated. The reactor had been running at half power for several hours, and during this period it had been accumulating xenon-135, a fission product, a radioactive gas that forms in the reactor core during operation, and that is itself a neutron absorber. In normal full-power operation, the rate at which xenon was produced was roughly balanced by the rate at which it was consumed by neutron absorption and by radioactive decay. At reduced power, the balance shifted. Xenon production continued but at a lower rate, while the rate of xenon consumption by neutron absorption decreased because there were fewer neutrons available at lower power. The result was an accumulation of xenon in the core, a phenomenon called xenon poisoning, that made the reactor increasingly difficult to control at low power. The reactor continued at half power through the afternoon and into the evening, accumulating xenon, while the Kiev grid controllers used its output to balance their system. At approximately 11 in the evening, the grid controller released the reactor. The test could proceed. The evening shift, which had come on duty at 4 in the afternoon and had been waiting for the grid controller's release, was headed by a shift foreman named Alexander Akimov. Akimov was 27 years old, careful and conscientious, a man who by most accounts took his responsibilities seriously and was well regarded by his colleagues. The senior reactor control operator on his shift was a man named Leonid Topchunov, who was 25 and had been operating RBMK reactors for approximately 8 months, relatively inexperienced for the task that he was about to be assigned. At approximately 11:20 in the evening, with Dyatlov present in the control room to oversee the test, Topchunov began reducing the reactor's power from its current level of 1,600 megawatts thermal toward the test level of 700 to 1,000 megawatts. The power reduction proceeded, and then something went wrong. Exactly what went wrong has been debated since. The most widely accepted account is that Topchunov made an error in setting the automatic power regulator, that he either failed to properly transfer the reactor from manual to automatic power control, or that he set the regulator incorrectly, or that the combination of xenon poisoning and operator error produced a result that neither Topchunov nor anyone else fully anticipated. Whatever the specific mechanism, the result was that the reactor's power, instead of stabilizing at the intended test level, continued to fall. It fell below 500 megawatts. It fell below 200 megawatts. It fell below 100 megawatts. The instrument readings flickered and dropped, and for a period of perhaps 30 seconds the reactor's power was so low, perhaps 30 megawatts, perhaps less, that it was barely above the point at which an emergency shutdown would be automatically triggered. This was a condition called a reactor scram threshold approach, and in the procedures that governed RBMK operation, It was a condition that required a specific response. If the reactor's power fell below a certain threshold during operation, the operators were required to shut it down and wait at least 24 hours before attempting to restart it. The 24-hour wait was necessary because after a period of very low power operation, the xenon that had accumulated in the core needed time to decay before the reactor could be safely operated again. Dyatlov ordered Toptunov and Akimov to restore power. This was a violation of procedure. The correct response to what had just happened, the power falling to near zero, was to shut the reactor down and wait. Dyatlov knew this, or should have known it. The test schedule, the pressure of the postponement, the long hours of waiting for the grid controller's release, whatever combination of factors was operating in his mind at 11:20 on the night of April the 25th, the decision he made was to restore power and proceed. Toptunov and Akimov began withdrawing control rods from the reactor core to restore power. As the rods were withdrawn, fewer neutrons were absorbed, and the chain reaction began to accelerate again. The power rose, slowly, uncertainly, impeded by the xenon that had accumulated during the hours of low-power operation. Toptunov withdrew more rods. More. The power rose. By approximately 1 in the morning of April the 26th, the reactor's power had stabilized at approximately 200 megawatts thermal, well below the intended test level of 700 to 1,000 megawatts, but apparently stable. In normal RBMK operating procedures, operating the reactor at 200 megawatts with a number of control rods that had been withdrawn to achieve that power level would have been prohibited. The RBMK's operating regulations required that a minimum number of control rods remain inserted in the core at all times. The specific number varied depending on the reactor's power level and other factors, but at 200 megawatts, the number of rods that Toptunov had withdrawn to counteract the xenon poisoning left the reactor with far fewer rods than the regulations permitted. This was another violation of procedure, and it was visible on the instruments in the control room to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Dyatlov decided to proceed with the test at 200 megawatts. The decision to proceed was a decision made under several compounding pressures. The test had already been delayed once, by the Kiev grid controller's request that the reactor continue supplying power through the afternoon. It was now nearly 1 in the morning of the 26th. The test had to be completed before the reactor was shut down for maintenance. If it was not completed now, it would have to be postponed until the next planned maintenance shutdown, which was more than a year away. Dyatlov had been waiting all day for this moment. The engineers from the turbine manufacturer who had come to supervise their part of the test had been waiting all day. The test would be conducted. In the control room of reactor number 4, the operators who would conduct the test and who would shortly attempt to manage its consequences were Alexander Akimov, the shift foreman at the central console, Leonid Toptunov, the senior reactor control operator at the reactor control panel, 2 more operators, Alexander Kodymchuk and Valery Perevoschenko, at other positions, and various additional personnel at the turbine and other equipment positions. Dyatlov stood in the room, supervising. Outside the control room, in the reactor building itself and in the turbine hall, other workers were in their positions. In the feedwater pump room beneath the reactor building, workers were managing the systems that supplied cooling water to the reactor. In the turbine hall, the turbine operators were at their stations. The test began at 1:23 and 4 seconds in the morning of April the 26th, 1986. The test operator closed the turbine control valve, cutting off the steam supply to the turbine and allowing it to begin coasting. The cooling pumps connected to the coasting turbine were now running on the diminishing electrical output of the slowing turbine, exactly the condition the test was designed to evaluate. As the turbine coasted and its speed declined, the electrical frequency it produced dropped. The cooling pumps connected to it began to slow. As the pumps slowed, the flow of cooling water through the reactor core decreased. As the cooling water flow decreased, the water already in the core began to absorb more heat, and more of it began to boil, converting from liquid water to steam. The steam bubbles displaced the liquid water in the fuel channels. In a reactor with the RBMK's positive void coefficient, this was exactly the wrong thing to happen. As the steam replaced the liquid water, the moderating effect of the water decreased. Fewer neutrons were slowed to the speeds at which they most effectively caused fission. But fewer neutrons absorbed by the water also meant more neutrons available to cause fission in the fuel. The power began to rise. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, 36 seconds after the test began, Leonid Toptunov saw his instruments and understood that something was wrong. The power was rising, he told Akimov. Akimov made the decision that anyone operating a nuclear reactor would make when the power began to rise unexpectedly and uncontrollably. He ordered an emergency shutdown. The emergency shutdown signal in the RBMK was given by pressing a button labelled AZ5, the Cyrillic abbreviation for the Emergency Protection System. When AZ5 was pressed, all 211 control rods were commanded to insert into the reactor core simultaneously, absorbing neutrons and bringing the chain reaction to a halt. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, Leonid Toptunov pressed the AZ5 button. The control rods began to descend into the core, and then something happened that none of the operators in the control room of reactor number 4 had been told was possible. The power, instead of falling as the control rods entered the core, rose. It rose fast. In the first 2 or 3 seconds after the AZ5 button was pressed, the graphite tips of the control rods, those tips that entered the fuel channels before the neutron-absorbing boron sections, increased the power output of the lower portion of the core. The power spike was enormous. In the 2 seconds between 1:23 and 41 and 1:23 and 43, the reactor's power output increased from its operating level of 200 megawatts to a level that the instruments could not measure, because the instruments had not been designed to measure what was happening, because what was happening was not supposed to be possible. The subsequent Soviet and international investigations estimated that in the few seconds between the pressing of the AZ5 button and the physical destruction of the reactor, the power output briefly reached somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 megawatts thermal, 10 times the reactor's designed maximum output. Some estimates have placed the peak even higher. The uncertainty reflects the fact that the instruments were not designed for this range, and that the reactor itself was destroyed in the moments that followed, making any post hoc measurement impossible. At approximately 1:23 and 47, 7 seconds after the AZ5 button was pressed, and 3 to 4 seconds after the power spike began, there was an explosion. The explosion was caused by the sudden and catastrophic conversion of the reactor's cooling water to steam. When the power spike occurred, the heat generation in the fuel exceeded the capacity of the cooling water to absorb it. The water flashed instantly to steam, not gradually, but instantaneously, as the water in contact with the superheated fuel went from liquid to gas in the fraction of a second. The resulting expansion was explosive. The steam explosion blew the top off the reactor, a steel and concrete lid weighing approximately 1,000 tons, and exposed the reactor core to the atmosphere. The exposed core, still generating enormous amounts of heat from the decay of the fission products that had accumulated during its operation, caught fire. Graphite from the moderator, ejected by the explosion, landed in various locations on the roof of the reactor building and in the surrounding area where it burned. Fuel fragments, chunks of nuclear fuel, some of them still undergoing fission, were scattered across the plant site and beyond. A second explosion followed approximately 2 to 3 seconds after the first. The exact nature of this second explosion has been debated extensively, with some investigators attributing it to a prompt criticality excursion, others to a hydrogen explosion, and still others to a steam explosion as additional water entered the destroyed reactor space. Whatever its specific cause, the second explosion scattered additional reactor material and intensified the fire. In the control room, the operators who had been present during the test stood in the silence that followed the explosions and looked at their instruments and tried to understand what had happened. The instruments told them very little that was useful. Most of the sensors in the reactor core had been destroyed in the explosion. Those that survived were reading values that were off the scale of what the instruments were designed to measure. The control rod position indicators showed all rods fully inserted. But the rods could not be fully inserted because the reactor was destroyed, and the channels into which the rods were supposed to descend no longer existed in their designed configuration. The reactor coolant pressure indicators showed either zero pressure or readings that made no physical sense. The core temperature indicators had simply ceased to function. Akimov looked at his instruments and reached a conclusion that was, Given everything he had been taught about the RBMK reactor, the only conclusion available to him, the reactor was intact. The explosions, whatever had caused them, had damaged equipment in the building, but the reactor itself was intact. The readings that made no sense were the result of instrument failures caused by the explosions. The reactor was intact and it needed to be cooled. He was wrong. The reactor was destroyed. What remained of its core was exposed to the atmosphere and burning. But Akimov did not know this, could not have known this given what he had been told about what the RBMK reactor was capable of doing, and so he and his operators spent the next several hours attempting to restore cooling water flow to a reactor that no longer existed, opening valves and starting pumps in an effort to save something that could not be saved, exposing themselves in the process to radiation levels that would kill most of them within days or weeks. Outside the reactor building, on the roof of the turbine hall and on the surrounding grounds of the plant, the firefighters were arriving. The fire brigade of the Chernobyl plant had been summoned within minutes of the explosion. The first call went out at 1:23, before the explosion in fact, as operators noticed anomalies and alerted the control room's emergency systems, and the fire alarm was triggered either automatically or by the explosion itself. The station's own fire brigade, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, arrived within minutes. Additional brigades from the town of Pripyat and from other nearby facilities were called and arrived in the half-hour that followed. The firefighters, who arrived at the plant in the first hour after the explosion, were not told that the reactor had been destroyed. They were told there was a fire on the roof of the reactor building and in the turbine hall, a serious fire certainly, but the kind of serious fire that firefighters are trained to fight. They did not know that the material burning on the roof included graphite from the reactor core and fragments of nuclear fuel. They did not know that the radiation levels in the areas where they were working were high enough to be lethal after minutes of exposure. They were told that there was a reactor accident, which they understood to mean some kind of malfunction of the reactor's equipment, not the complete destruction of the reactor itself. Lieutenant Pravik and his crew climbed to the roof of the reactor building and the turbine hall and began fighting the fires. They wore ordinary firefighting gear, boots and helmets and protective clothing designed for the thermal hazards of a conventional fire, not for the radiation hazards of an exposed reactor core. They stepped on pieces of graphite that glowed with heat and with radioactivity. They breathed air that was thick with radioactive particles. The men nearest the exposed reactor core received radiation doses that would have been lethal within an hour if they had been able to measure them. Several of the firefighters began to feel sick almost immediately. The specific syndrome of acute radiation poisoning, the nausea, the vomiting, the metallic taste in the mouth, the skin that turned red and then blistered as if sunburned from the inside, announced itself within minutes of their most intense exposures. Some of them vomited on the roof. Some of them passed out and had to be carried down. The men who were most severely irradiated had received doses so large that their bodies' systems were being destroyed at the cellular level in real time, though they did not yet understand this, and their colleagues did not yet understand this, and the commanders directing the firefighting operation did not yet fully understand this. One firefighter, Vasyl Ignatenko, worked on the roof of the reactor building for most of the first hour after the explosion. His wife Lyudmila was at home in Pripyat, pregnant with their first child, asleep when the explosion occurred. She would later describe being woken by a light that was not the sun, a light coming from the direction of the plant that was different from any light she had seen. She would describe going to the window and seeing the glow and thinking that there must be a fire, and going back to sleep because her husband was a firefighter and fires were what her husband did. Vasyl Ignatenko was one of the firefighters who would die of acute radiation syndrome in the days that followed. In the plant's operational offices, the night shift supervisors were making calls. The plant director, Viktor Bryukhanov, was awakened at his apartment in Pripyat and came to the plant. He found a situation that he either could not fully comprehend or was not willing to fully comprehend, and the information that he reported up the chain of command in the hours following the explosion was systematically and disastrously understated. The radiation levels that he reported to Moscow were far below the actual levels on the plant grounds. The extent of the damage to the reactor that he described was far less than the actual damage. The account he gave, that there had been an explosion in the reactor building, that the reactor itself was intact, That radiation levels were elevated but not catastrophically high was the account that reached the Moscow officials who would need to respond to the accident, and it shaped their response in ways that cost additional lives. Bryukhanov's minimization of the accident was not purely cynical. He was, at least in part, reporting what Akimov and the other operators were telling him, and Akimov's belief that the reactor was intact was genuine, if wrong. The culture of the Soviet nuclear industry also played a role. The political consequences of reporting a serious accident were severe, and the incentives for minimizing what had happened were powerful. Bryukhanov was a product of that culture and those incentives, and in the shock of the first hours after the explosion, when so much was uncertain and so much of the information reaching him was contradictory, the path of least resistance was to report the least alarming version of events consistent with what he knew. The dosimetrists, the radiation measurement technicians whose job it was to monitor radiation levels at the plant, were also, in the first hours, reporting numbers that did not reflect reality. This was partly because the dosimeters available in the plant had upper limits below the actual radiation levels in the most severely affected areas. When a dosimeter's reading went to its maximum, it didn't mean radiation levels had stabilized at that level. It meant the instrument couldn't measure higher. Some of the dosimeters in use at the plant had maximum readings of 3.6 roentgens per hour. 3.6 roentgens per hour was serious. The actual radiation levels in some areas of the plant in the first hours were measured by the instruments that could reach those ranges in the hundreds of roentgens per hour, levels that would cause severe radiation sickness after a few minutes of exposure and death within days. The actual radiation levels were in some areas high enough that the measurement instruments that could have detected them were not available on site. They were in a safe in the plant director's office, and in the confusion and the scale of the emergency, no one had thought to retrieve them. The city of Pripyat, 4 kilometers from the burning reactor, was not evacuated that night. The residents of Pripyat went to sleep, those who had not been awakened by the explosions which were heard across the city and did not know what had happened. Those who had been awakened saw the glow in the direction of the plant, and most of them went back to sleep. A few went to the railway bridge at the edge of the city, which offered a clear view toward the plant, and stood there watching the fire, not knowing that they were standing in the path of a radioactive plume that was drifting from the burning reactor across the city and beyond. The plume was visible. In the darkness above the reactor, the air itself seemed to glow, not with flame, but with a pale blue and violet light that several witnesses described as unlike anything they had ever seen. This was Cherenkov radiation, the light emitted when charged particles move through a medium faster than light moves through that medium, the visual signature of intense radioactivity in the open air above the destroyed reactor core. It was beautiful in a cold and terrible way. The people who saw it from a distance did not know what they were looking at. Several of them later described standing and watching it for minutes, even for half an hour before going home. Inside the plant, as the night progressed toward dawn, the scale of what had happened was beginning, slowly, incompletely, to become clear to those who were present. The operators who had been sent into the most highly irradiated areas of the plant to restore cooling water flow were returning with symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. Some of them were vomiting. Some of them had skin that was beginning to show the redness of a radiation burn. The plant's medical staff, working in the plant's small medical facility, were seeing patients whose symptoms they recognized from their training as consistent with high radiation doses, though the doses they were dealing with were beyond anything their training had specifically prepared them for. Akimov, in the control room, continued to direct his operators to open valves and start pumps, trying to get cooling water into the reactor. He did not yet believe the reactor was destroyed. The evidence that it was destroyed was available. The people returning from the reactor building and the roof with their vomiting and their red skin. The dosimeters reading their maximums and stopping. The instruments in the control room giving readings that made no physical sense. But the evidence was inconsistent with what Akimov knew about what the reactor was capable of. He could not square what he was seeing with what he believed, and in that conflict he continued to act on what he believed. Sometime in the early hours of April the 26th, Akimov walked from the control room into the reactor building. He wanted to see for himself what was happening with the equipment. He and a colleague walked through the building, working on valves, trying to understand why the cooling water wasn't getting through. The The radiation levels in the areas he was walking through were, by the later estimates of the investigating commission, in the range that would deliver a lethal dose in minutes. Alexander Akimov would die of acute radiation syndrome on May the 11th, 1986, 15 days after the explosion, at the age of 33. Leonid Toptonov, the reactor control operator who had pressed the AZ-5 button, would die on May the 14th at the age of 25. Most of the operators who had been in the control room and in the plant during the hours following the explosion would survive, because their exposures, while serious, had been below the lethal threshold, but they carried the radiation in their bodies, and some of them would carry its consequences for the rest of their lives. Outside, in the city of Pripyat, the day of April the 26th was beginning to dawn. The sun came up over the Plesian forest in the east, and its light fell on the apartment buildings and the wide streets and the fairground with its new Ferris wheel, and the school where children would be arriving in a few hours, and the residents of Pripyat, most of them, began their morning in the ordinary way: coffee, breakfast, the children getting ready for school, the workers whose shifts began at 7 preparing to leave their apartments and walk, or take the bus to the plant. 4 kilometers to the south, the reactor was still burning. The graphite in the core would continue to burn for days, sending a radioactive plume across Ukraine and Belarus and Sweden and Western Europe, a plume that would eventually be detected across the Northern Hemisphere, and that would make Chernobyl not merely a Soviet accident, but a global event. The firefighters who had fought the initial fires were being transported to hospitals in Pripyat and in Kiev. The operators who had been in the most exposed areas of the plant were beginning to show the full symptoms of radiation poisoning. The plant director was on the phone to Moscow, reporting in the careful, minimized language of a man who either did not understand what had happened or did not want to be the person who said it clearly. And in Moscow, in the offices of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the Soviet ministry responsible for nuclear energy, the officials who would eventually be responsible for managing the response to the accident were beginning to receive the first fragmentary reports of something that had happened at a nuclear plant in Ukraine, something whose nature was, at this early stage, unclear, even to those closest to it. The city of Pripyat continued to wake up. The morning of April the 26th arrived in the ordinary way of mornings in northern Ukraine in the spring, cool and clear, with the pale light of a sun that was still low over the forest, and the smell of the Pripyat River and the pine trees, and the sounds of a city beginning its day. Children walked to school. Buses ran their routes. The market stalls opened. The day began. Nobody told them anything. The city of Pripyat woke up on the morning of April the 26th, 1986, and went about the beginning of a Saturday in the ordinary way of a Soviet city going about a Saturday. The April air was cool and clear, the kind of early spring morning that in this part of Ukraine carried the smell of the forest and the river, and the particular freshness of a season that had not yet become summer. Children who did not have school that Saturday, it was, for some of them, a normal school day regardless, and they went, played on the wide Soviet boulevards between the apartment blocks. Couples walked along the embankment of the Pripyat River. The outdoor market in the city centre was open and doing its ordinary Saturday business. 4 kilometres to the south, visible from almost any elevated point in the city, the remains of reactor number 4 continued to burn. The plume from the burning reactor was moving northwest, carried by the prevailing wind at low altitude, across the city of Pripyat, and beyond into the forests of Plesia, and further on into the Soviet Republic of Belarus. The plume was not visible in the morning sunlight. It was not the black smoke of a conventional fire, but the invisible contamination of radioactive particles and gases dispersed in the air, carried on the wind at whatever altitude, and in whatever concentration the meteorology of that particular morning dictated. The people walking on Pripyat's boulevards and shopping in its market and sitting on benches in its parks were breathing this plume. Their children playing outside were breathing it. The babies in the maternity ward of the city's hospital were breathing it. The official decision not to evacuate Pripyat on the morning of April the 26th was made in Moscow, and it was made on the basis of the information that was available in Moscow, and that information was shaped by everything that had happened in the hours since the explosion, by Bryukhanov's minimized reports, by the culture of the Soviet bureaucracy that had learned over decades to tell its superiors what its superiors wanted to hear, and by the genuine uncertainty of the first hours after an accident, whose scale had not yet been fully understood by anyone. In Moscow, the first reports of the accident had reached the duty officers of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building in the early morning hours of the 26th. The reports described an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, an explosion, fires, elevated radiation levels. They did not describe the destruction of a reactor. They did not describe radiation levels in the hundreds of roentgens per hour on the plant grounds. They described a serious incident that had resulted in casualties among the plant's workers and firefighters, elevated radiation in the plant's vicinity, and fires that were being fought. The response that the reports called for was a government commission, a delegation of senior officials and technical experts who would be sent to the site to assess the situation and direct the response. The commission was assembled rapidly. Its head was Boris Sherbina, deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, a senior official of the Soviet government who was on a flight to Siberia on unrelated business when the accident occurred and was recalled to Moscow. The technical members of the commission included Valery Legasov, a chemist and deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, the Soviet Union's premier nuclear research institute, and several other nuclear engineers and specialists. The commission flew to Kiev on the morning of the 26th and drove to the site. Legasov, on the flight and during the drive, began reading the briefing materials that had been assembled about the RBMK reactor and about what was known of the accident. He was not an RBMK specialist. His background was in physical chemistry and in various aspects of nuclear research, not in reactor operations, but he was a first-rate scientist with the ability to read technical material quickly and extract its meaning. By the time the Commission's bus was approaching the Chernobyl plant, he had developed a preliminary picture of what might have happened, though he was not yet certain, and the picture he had was worse than what the official reports had described. When the Commission arrived at the plant, and Legasov began talking to the engineers and physicists who had been on site since the accident, the picture became worse still. The readings of radiation on the plant grounds, the actual readings, not the minimized readings that had gone to Moscow, were alarming. The state of the reactor building was alarming. The physical evidence, the graphite fragments on the ground, the fuel fragments, the characteristic appearance of the material that had been ejected from the building, was alarming in a way that was specific and unmistakable to someone who knew what he was looking at. Legasov knew what he was looking at. He understood, within a relatively short time of his arrival at the plant, that the reactor had been destroyed, not damaged, not malfunctioning, but physically destroyed, its core exposed to the atmosphere and burning. He understood that the radiation levels on the plant grounds and in the surrounding area were far higher than the official reports had indicated. He understood that the city of Pripyat, 4 kilometers away, was in a contaminated area that needed to be evacuated. The decision to evacuate Pripyat was made on the afternoon of April the 26th. The evacuation itself did not begin until the morning of April the 27th, approximately 36 hours after the explosion. The 36-hour delay had consequences. It is impossible to calculate with precision how many people received how much additional radiation exposure as a result of spending a day and a half in the contaminated city rather than being removed immediately. The epidemiological studies conducted in the years and decades following the accident have produced a range of estimates, and the range is wide because the uncertainties are many, the variations in individual exposure depending on where people were and what they were doing, the long latency periods of radiation-induced cancer that make attribution difficult, the other health effects of the accident and the evacuation, and the social disruption that followed. What can be said is that approximately 49,000 people spent up to 36 additional hours in a city that was being contaminated by an ongoing radioactive release, and that this additional exposure had consequences for human health that were real, even if they were difficult to measure precisely. The 36-hour delay also reflected something about the Soviet system and its priorities in those days that is worth understanding. The Soviet state had, in the decades since the Second World War, built its legitimacy partly on the claim of technological mastery, on the argument that socialist planning and Soviet science were capable of achievements that the capitalist world could not match. The space program, the nuclear program, the industrial achievements of the post-war decades were all elements of this claim. A serious nuclear accident, an accident that exposed the failure of the Soviet system to manage the technology it had built, was not merely an operational problem to be solved, but a political problem of the first order, a threat to the narrative of Soviet competence that the state had been constructing for 40 years. The instinct of the Soviet bureaucracy in the face of this threat was the instinct it had developed over those same 40 years, to minimize, to control information, to manage the narrative, to delay actions that would signal the scale of the problem. The evacuation of Pripyat, once it was decided, was described to its residents in terms that were carefully calibrated to avoid alarm. It was presented as a temporary precautionary measure, 3 days at most, and residents were told to bring only the most essential items. Most of them left behind nearly everything they owned. Many of them assumed they would be back by the end of the week. None of them would return to live in Pripyat. The evacuation began at approximately 2 in the afternoon on April the 27th. 1,200 buses had been assembled, drawn from Kiev, from the surrounding region, from wherever they could be requisitioned. The buses pulled up to the apartment blocks and the residents came down with their bags and their children and their cats and dogs, though they would be told eventually that they could not take their pets, and got on the buses and were driven away. The operation was, by the standards of Soviet bureaucratic logistics, surprisingly efficient. The entire city of nearly 50,000 people was evacuated in approximately 3.5 hours. The residents left and the city fell silent. The street market closed. The amusement park with its new Ferris wheel stood empty. The schools and the hospital and the culture palace and the hotel stood empty. The apartment blocks with their balconies and their satellite dishes and their potted plants visible through the windows stood empty. The food in the refrigerators began to spoil. The houseplants began to die. The pets that had been left behind wandered the empty streets. Pripyat would never be inhabited again. It is today one of the most visited ghost towns in the world, a place where tourists come to see the specific and terrible beauty of a human environment that has been reclaimed very partially by nature, the apartment blocks slowly crumbling, the trees growing through the floors of the buildings, the Ferris wheel still standing in its fairground, the school still containing the books and toys and gas masks that were left behind when the children were evacuated. The radioactive contamination that caused the evacuation has, over the decades, partially decayed. The shorter-lived isotopes have gone, though the longer-lived ones remain. But Pripyat remains uninhabitable by the standards of Soviet and Ukrainian regulations, and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. While the evacuation of Pripyat was being organized, the more immediate problem, what to do about the burning reactor, was being addressed by the Government Commission and by the technical specialists who had been assembled at the site. The burning reactor presented a challenge that had no precedent in the history of nuclear power. The core of reactor number 4 was exposed to the atmosphere and burning, generating a radioactive plume that was being carried by the wind across Ukraine and beyond. The burning graphite in the core was sustaining a high temperature that was maintaining the radioactive release. The fission products that had accumulated in the reactor during its 2.5 years of operation, cesium, strontium, iodine, and dozens of other radioactive isotopes, were being volatilized by the heat and dispersed into the environment. The initial approach to stopping the burning was to smother it from the air, to drop material onto the exposed reactor core from helicopters that would fly over it and release their loads. The materials chosen were sand and boron, sand to smother the fire physically, and boron to absorb neutrons and prevent any further nuclear chain reaction in whatever fuel remained intact in the core. Lead was also used to absorb the gamma radiation being emitted from the core and to carry heat away from the burning material. The helicopter pilots who conducted these drops were doing something that had no precedent and no established safety protocols. They were flying over an exposed, burning nuclear reactor at altitudes that exposed them to very high radiation levels, making repeated passes to drop their loads with sufficient accuracy to have any effect. The cockpits of the helicopters provided essentially no radiation shielding. The pilots received significant radiation doses, in some cases doses that would shorten their lives, though the connection between the exposures and the subsequent health effects would take years or decades to become apparent. The drops began on April the 27th and continued for days. In total, approximately 5,000 tons of material was deposited on the reactor from the air. The drops reduced the visible fire and reduced the rate of radioactive release from the core, but they did not eliminate it. The core continued to burn at a lower level, the radioactive release continued, and the situation remained dangerous and uncertain. The specific uncertainty that worried the physicists most in the days immediately after the explosion was the question of what was happening to the fuel that remained in the core. Some of the fuel had been ejected in the explosion. Some of it remained in what was left of the core at high temperature, in contact with the graphite moderator that was burning. The concern was that the remaining fuel, in contact with the burning graphite and in the presence of the cooling water that was still being pumped into the area, might accumulate in a configuration that would support a new criticality, a new nuclear chain reaction. If a criticality occurred in the melted fuel, the resulting steam explosion, the Chernobyl accident had already demonstrated that steam explosions in nuclear reactors could be catastrophic, might be large enough to destroy not only what remained of reactor number 4, but the other 3 reactors in the station, and the spent fuel storage facilities, and potentially much more. The physicists who were calculating this possibility were doing their calculations with incomplete information, under extreme time pressure, and arriving at estimates whose uncertainty ranges were very wide. The worst-case scenarios were genuinely catastrophic. Scenarios in which a second explosion at Chernobyl could contaminate an area large enough to affect Moscow, could make much of Ukraine and Belarus uninhabitable for decades. These calculations drove some of the most dangerous decisions of the emergency response. Beneath the reactor building was a large space, called the bubbler pool, that served as a water reservoir for the reactor's emergency cooling system. This pool contained approximately 6,000 cubic meters of water. The concern was that the melting nuclear fuel from reactor number 4, as it burned through the reactor's floor, might eventually reach this water. Hot nuclear fuel in contact with water in an enclosed space would produce steam, and depending on how much fuel reached the water and how fast, the steam might produce an explosion. To prevent this, the water in the bubbler pool needed to be drained before the fuel reached it. The drain valves for the pool were in a flooded corridor beneath the reactor building. To open those valves, someone had to go into the flooded corridor, locate the valves, and turn them. 3 men volunteered. Alexei Ananenko, a senior mechanical engineer who knew the location of the valves. Valery Bespalov, another engineer, and Boris Baranov, a shift supervisor who had a dive suit. They put on protective equipment, wetsuits, dosimeters, the limited protection available, and went into the flooded corridor. The corridor was flooded with water that was itself contaminated with radioactive material from the accident. The men moved through the water, in the darkness of the flooded space, with flashlights searching for the valves. They found them, they opened them, they came back out. The water in the bubbler pool drained over the following hours. The immediate threat of a steam explosion beneath the reactor was eliminated. The 3 men survived, a fact that was uncertain for some time after the incident, as accounts of their fates were confused, and some early reports suggested they had died. They received radiation doses during the operation, but not lethal doses, and they lived to tell what they had done. The threat of a steam explosion was not the only underground concern. Below the reactor, the foundation of the building was made of sand and concrete. The fear of some physicists was that the hot nuclear fuel from the core, the so-called corium, a molten mixture of uranium fuel, zirconium cladding, graphite moderator, and structural materials that forms when a nuclear reactor melts down, might melt through the reactor building's floor and begin moving downward through the sand of the foundation toward the water table. If the corium reached the water table, the resulting steam explosion and the dispersal of radioactive material could be severe. If the corium kept moving, it might reach the Pripyat River, contaminating the water supply for the entire region. To prevent this, a plan was developed to freeze the soil beneath the reactor by drilling boreholes around the building and injecting liquid nitrogen, to create essentially a frozen barrier of soil beneath the reactor that would stop the corium's descent before it reached the groundwater. The drilling teams worked under significant radiation exposure, operating large drilling equipment in areas where the dose rates were high enough to require strict time limits on each worker's exposure. The boreholes were drilled, the nitrogen was injected. Whether this measure was necessary, whether the corium was actually moving toward the groundwater, or whether it had already solidified, has been debated since. The subsequent investigation of the reactor building, conducted in later years as the cleanup proceeded, found that the corium had not moved as far as the worst-case models had predicted, and had solidified in a location above the water table. But in the days and weeks after the explosion, with incomplete information and the worst-case scenarios genuinely possible, the decision to take precautionary action was reasonable, and the workers who drilled those boreholes and injected the nitrogen did so in the knowledge that their work might be saving millions of people from a much larger catastrophe. The scale of the human response to the Chernobyl accident in the weeks and months that followed was immense. Ultimately, approximately 600,000 Soviet citizens were involved in the cleanup operations that continued for years. Workers who would come to be known as the liquidators, a term that referred to their job of liquidating the consequences of the accident. They came from all over the Soviet Union, mobilized through the military, through the civilian workforce, through the Communist Party structures that organized Soviet society in those years. They included military reservists called up for service, construction workers, miners, engineers, scientists, firefighters, soldiers. They worked in conditions of high radiation exposure, often without adequate protective equipment, often without accurate information about the actual radiation levels in the areas where they were working. The most immediate task was the cleanup of the plant site itself, the removal of the radioactive graphite and fuel fragments that had been scattered across the roof of the turbine hall and across the surrounding grounds by the explosion. The graphite and fuel fragments were among the most intensely radioactive materials on the site, with dose rates in the immediate vicinity of hundreds or thousands of Roentgens per hour. Working in areas with these dose rates, a person would receive a lethal radiation dose in minutes. Remote-controlled robots were sent to the roof to remove the graphite and fuel. The robots, West German models as it turned out, that were more capable than the Soviet equipment available, failed. The radiation levels on the roof were so high that the electronics in the robots' control systems were destroyed or disrupted by the radiation, causing the robots to malfunction. The remote control signals were degraded by the radiation environment. The robots could not complete the task. The job was given to humans. Soldiers and civilian workers were sent onto the roof of the turbine hall in short shifts, measured not in hours but in minutes, sometimes in seconds, to shovel the graphite and fuel fragments off the roof. Each worker would put on his protective equipment, a lead apron, dosimetry equipment, a respirator, climb to the roof, shovel material for his allotted time, and come back down. The allotted time was determined by the radiation levels on the roof and the maximum dose each worker was permitted to receive on a single shift. In the most heavily contaminated areas of the roof, the allotted time for a single shift was 90 seconds. Workers who were sent to these areas knew they had 90 seconds. They climbed, they worked, they came back down. These workers were called bio-robots by some of those who organized the operation, a name that acknowledges with the specific dark humor of people managing an impossible situation that the robots had failed and that humans were being used in their place as something very close to disposable components of the cleanup machinery. The workers on the roof received radiation doses that varied depending on where they worked and how long they stayed. The doses were tracked, imperfectly, in an environment of high radiation levels and inadequate dosimetry, and workers were pulled from the cleanup when they reached their permitted dose limits. The dose limits themselves were, in some cases, adjusted upward as the operation continued, and the authorities realized that the cleanup could not be completed within the original limits without using more workers than were available. This adjustment, increasing the permitted dose to allow each worker to be exposed to more radiation before being rotated out, was made by officials under pressure, and it had consequences for the long-term health of the workers who were permitted to accumulate higher doses. The long-term health effects of the radiation exposures received by the liquidators are a subject that has been debated and studied for the 4 decades since the accident, and the debate has not been fully resolved. The studies have been complicated by the large number of workers involved, by the imprecision of the dose records for many of them, by the long latency of radiation-induced cancer, by the confounding effects of the social and economic disruption that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, and by the political and institutional pressures on both sides, those who wanted to minimize the health effects and those who wanted to maximize them, that have influenced the framing and interpretation of the research. What can be said with confidence is that the workers who received the highest doses particularly those who worked in the most contaminated areas of the plant in the days immediately after the explosion, experienced significantly elevated rates of cancer, particularly thyroid cancer and leukemia, and significantly elevated mortality. The workers who received lower doses, those who worked further from the destroyed reactor, or whose exposure was more limited, show less clear evidence of radiation-induced health effects, though the studies continue and the evidence continues to accumulate. Among the most tragic of the immediate victims were the plant workers and firefighters who received acute radiation doses in the first hours after the explosion. In total, 237 people were diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome in the aftermath of the accident. Of these, 28 died in the months following the accident from the direct effects of their radiation exposure. Several more died in subsequent years of causes related to their radiation exposure, and a number of those who survived the acute syndrome suffered lasting health effects. The firefighters who were the first responders, the men from the plant's fire brigade and from Pripyat who arrived within minutes of the explosion and worked on the roof of the reactor building without any knowledge of the radiation levels they were encountering, were among the most severely exposed. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, who commanded the plant's fire brigade, died of acute radiation syndrome on May the 11th, the same day as Alexander Akimov. Lieutenant Viktor Kibanok, who led the Pripyat fire brigade, died on May the 11th as well. Major Leonid Telyatnikov, who commanded the combined firefighting operation at the plant, survived but with serious health consequences. The firefighters who died were young men. Pravik was 23. Kibanok was 23. The average age of the acute radiation syndrome fatalities was in the late 20s and early 30s. They had received their fatal doses in the first hours after the explosion, before anyone had told them what they were walking into, before anyone had given them dosimeters that could read the levels they were encountering, before anyone had said the word reactor to them in a way that conveyed what the actual situation was. They had fought the fire with the knowledge and the equipment they had, and the fire they had been given was not the kind of fire that knowledge and equipment could protect against. The news of the accident reached the outside world in stages, through channels that the Soviet state did not control. On April the 28th, 2 days after the explosion, workers arriving at the Forsmark nuclear power station in Sweden passed through the radiation monitoring system at the plant entrance and triggered alarms. Their shoes were contaminated with radioactive material that had come from the Chernobyl plume, which had travelled across Poland and the Baltic and had arrived in Scandinavia. The Swedes measured the material on the workers' shoes and determined that it was radioactively contaminated. They determined that the contamination was external, not from the Forsmark plant, and began looking for the source. The source was quickly identified as Soviet. The specific isotopic signature of the contamination pointed to a nuclear reactor accident, and the wind trajectories pointed to the Soviet Union. The Swedes contacted the Soviet embassy. The Soviet embassy, following the standard protocols of the Soviet information management system, knew nothing and said nothing. The Swedes went public. On the afternoon of April the 28th, the Swedish authorities announced that they had detected radioactive contamination of Soviet origin and were demanding an explanation. Other Scandinavian and European countries began reporting elevated radiation levels. The contamination was spreading across the continent, following the wind patterns that had carried the Chernobyl plume westward. The Soviet response to this public pressure was a brief announcement on the evening of April the 28th, 48 hours after the explosion, that there had been an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, that measures were being taken to correct the situation, and that the necessary assistance was being provided to those affected. The announcement contained no specifics about the nature of the accident, the scale of the release, or the ongoing danger. It was the minimum disclosure that the external pressure made necessary. The full account of what had happened at Chernobyl, the destruction of the reactor, the scale of the contamination, the failures of Soviet nuclear safety culture that had contributed to the accident, would not be disclosed by the Soviet government for months. It would be disclosed when it came, not because of any internal Soviet impulse toward transparency, but because of two external pressures: the physical reality of the contaminated plume that was depositing radioactive material across Europe, and the approaching meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency at which the Soviet Union would be expected to give a full accounting of the accident. The IAEA meeting took place in Vienna in August of 1986, approximately 4 months after the accident. The Soviet presentation was given by Legasov, the chemist who had been part of the government commission from the first day, who had spent the 4 intervening months working on the accident and on the explanation of what had happened. The presentation Legasov gave was, by the standards of Soviet official disclosure, remarkably complete. It described the RBMK reactor and its characteristics. It described the test that had been planned and how it had gone wrong. It described the design flaws in the reactor that had contributed to the accident, the positive void coefficient, the graphite-tipped control rods. It described the operator errors and the organizational failures that had allowed those design flaws to produce a catastrophic outcome. The Western nuclear scientists who attended the Vienna meeting were, by most accounts, genuinely surprised by the completeness of the Soviet disclosure. They had expected a carefully managed presentation that minimized the Soviet failures and emphasized the extraordinary circumstances of the accident. What they got was a document that, while it did emphasize operator error in its framing, attributing more responsibility to the operators and less to the reactor's design than subsequent analysis would support, nevertheless disclosed the essential facts about what had happened and why with a specificity and candor that was unprecedented in Soviet nuclear safety communication. The disclosure was also, as it later became clear, incomplete in one important respect. The RBMK design flaws that Legasov described, the positive void coefficient, the graphite tip control rods, were presented as if they had not been previously known. This was not entirely accurate. The positive void coefficient had been known for years. The problem with the graphite tip control rods had been identified in the internal safety review of 1983 and had not been corrected. The institutional failures that had allowed these known problems to persist in the operating reactors were not fully disclosed in Vienna and would not be fully disclosed for years. Legasov knew what he was presenting and what he was not presenting. He knew the difference between the complete account and the account he was authorized to give. He knew that the institutional failures of the Soviet nuclear establishment, the culture of secrecy, the suppression of safety concerns for political and economic reasons, the failure to share safety-relevant information between Soviet nuclear facilities and between the Soviet nuclear program and the international community, were not being fully acknowledged in the Vienna presentation. He would spend the years following Vienna in a kind of tortured ambivalence about what he had said and what he had not said. He was awarded the Hero of Socialist Labour for his work on the Chernobyl response. He was also, over those same years, subjected to institutional pressures and personal diminishments that those who knew him attributed to his having said too much in Vienna, to having disclosed more than the Soviet nuclear establishment wanted disclosed. He became increasingly depressed, increasingly isolated from the institutions he had spent his career in. On April the 27th, 1988, the second anniversary of the evacuation of Pripyat, 2 years to the day after Chernobyl's residents had been told to take 3 days' worth of belongings and board the buses, Valery Legasov killed himself in his Moscow apartment. He was 51 years old. He left behind audio recordings in which he described, in more complete terms than he had been able to use publicly, what he had witnessed at Chernobyl and what he believed needed to be changed in Soviet nuclear safety culture. The recordings were suppressed for several years after his death and were eventually released. The Chernobyl accident and its aftermath had effects that extended far beyond the immediate consequences for those who were exposed to radiation. It had effects on the Soviet state and on the trajectory of the Soviet system that are still debated by historians, but that most serious analysts regard as significant. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1986, he had been in office for approximately a year when the accident occurred, later said that Chernobyl was more important to the course of the Soviet Union's subsequent history than his own reforms, and that it had convinced him that the system he was trying to reform was more deeply broken than he had realized. The accident demonstrated, in a way that was visible to the entire world, the gap between the Soviet state's claims about its technological mastery and the reality of how its institutions actually functioned. The secrecy, the minimization, the culture of telling superiors what they wanted to hear rather than what was true. Gorbachev's push for glasnost, for openness, for more honest public discourse, accelerated after Chernobyl, in direct response to the damage that the initial concealment of the accident had done to Soviet credibility abroad and to the Soviet state's legitimacy at home. Whether Chernobyl caused the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Gorbachev's statement has sometimes been interpreted to imply, is probably too strong a claim. The Soviet Union had structural problems that predated Chernobyl, and that would have produced a crisis with or without it. But Chernobyl accelerated certain dynamics: the loss of public confidence in Soviet institutions, the spread of information that the state could not control, the demonstrations by people in Ukraine and Belarus whose anger at the accident's handling became connected to broader nationalist and democratic movements that contributed to the conditions in which the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. In Ukraine specifically, the Chernobyl accident was transformative. The sense of betrayal that Ukrainians felt at having their city evacuated 36 hours after the explosion, at having been left in a contaminated environment while officials in Moscow managed the information flow, at having been the site of a disaster caused by a reactor design whose dangers had been known and concealed, became part of the political consciousness of a generation. The Ukrainian independence movement that emerged in the late 1980s and that culminated in Ukraine's declaration of independence in 1991 drew on many sources, but the Chernobyl accident and its handling were among them. The physical task of containing the Chernobyl disaster, of preventing the ongoing release of radioactive material from the destroyed reactor, required the construction of a structure that would enclose the reactor and prevent further contamination of the environment. This structure, built in the months following the accident under conditions of enormous difficulty and significant radiation exposure, was called the sarcophagus, and the name was apt because it was a tomb enclosing the remains of a reactor that could not be repaired or removed but could only be sealed away. The sarcophagus was built by approximately 90,000 workers over approximately 7 months, using construction techniques that had to be developed specifically for this application because nothing like it had been built before. The workers rotated through the construction site in shifts that were strictly limited by the radiation levels in the work areas. The closer to the reactor, the shorter the permitted shift. The construction involved ordinary workers doing ordinary construction tasks, laying concrete, welding steel, operating cranes and other equipment, in an environment of elevated radiation exposure, wearing protective suits and respirators that reduced but did not eliminate their exposure, working alongside dosimetrists who tracked their accumulated doses and pulled them from the work when they reached their limits. The sarcophagus was completed in November of 1986, approximately 7 months after the explosion. It enclosed the remains of reactor number 4 in a structure of steel and concrete that was intended to prevent the further release of radioactive material into the environment and to protect the destroyed reactor from the elements. It was built quickly, under extreme circumstances, and it showed it. The structure had gaps and cracks and design compromises that reflected the conditions of its construction. It was not a permanent solution. It was a temporary containment, bought at enormous human cost, intended to last long enough for a better solution to be found. The better solution took nearly 30 years to build. In November of 2016, a new containment structure, a massive steel arch, 108 meters tall and 257 meters wide, the largest movable metal structure in the world, was slid into place over the old sarcophagus, covering it and providing a more robust barrier against the radioactive material inside. The new safe confinement, as it was called, was designed to last for 100 years, long enough for the shorter-lived radioactive isotopes inside to decay to less dangerous levels, and for the technology to be developed that might eventually allow the fuel and radioactive material to be safely removed. Inside the containment, the corium, the melted mixture of nuclear fuel and structural materials that formed during the accident, still exists. The largest deposit of corium, a formation nicknamed the Elephant's Foot because of its shape, sits in a room below the destroyed reactor. The Elephant's Foot was discovered in December of 1986, when a remote-controlled camera was sent into the basement of the reactor building to document the physical state of the material. The camera found a solid, dark, lava-like formation that had been created when the molten corium from the destroyed reactor flowed through cracks in the building's floor and collected in the basement rooms below, where it solidified. The Elephant's Foot is still highly radioactive. In the months after its formation, the radiation level at its surface was high enough to kill a human being in approximately 5 minutes. Today, 38 years after the accident, the radiation level at its surface has declined to a level that would still be extremely dangerous, enough to cause radiation sickness in less than an hour of exposure, but that a person could survive with a brief exposure if properly protected. Scientists have approached it, photographed it, and studied it, but it remains in place in the basement of the sealed building as one of the most intensely radioactive objects on Earth. The exclusion zone, the area around the Chernobyl plant from which all permanent residents were evacuated following the accident, encompasses approximately 2,700 square kilometers of land in northern Ukraine. The city of Pripyat is within the exclusion zone. The small town of Chernobyl, which gives the station its name, is within the exclusion zone. Dozens of villages that were evacuated in the weeks and months after the accident are within the exclusion zone. In total, approximately 350,000 people were permanently relocated from the areas affected by the accident. The exclusion zone today is a strange and in some ways beautiful place, a landscape of forests and wetlands and collapsed farmhouses and abandoned villages where wildlife has returned in abundance in the absence of human habitation. The forests around Chernobyl contain wolves and lynx and bears and horses and wild boar and hundreds of species of birds, more biodiversity than comparable forests outside the zone, because the human activity that had depressed wildlife populations in the decades before the accident is absent. The radioactive contamination that persists in the soil and vegetation does not appear to have suppressed the wildlife population in the zone to a significant degree, though the long-term genetic effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure on the zone's animal populations remain an area of active research. The relationship between the radioactive contamination and the ecological recovery of the exclusion zone is one of the most studied and most debated aspects of the Chernobyl aftermath. The simple version, that the absence of humans is better for wildlife than the presence of radiation is bad for it, appears to be broadly true in the exclusion zone, though the studies continue and the picture is more complex than the simple version suggests. Chernobyl has become, inadvertently, one of the world's most extensive experiments in the ecology of radiation exposure, and the scientists who study it have been producing findings that complicate the standard models of radiation's effects on ecosystems. The accident at Chernobyl had effects on nuclear power policy worldwide that were significant and lasting. In the years immediately following the accident, nuclear power programs in several countries were slowed, suspended, or cancelled. Sweden voted to phase out nuclear power. Germany delayed and ultimately decided to phase out its nuclear program, a decision that was partly influenced by Chernobyl and was ultimately reversed and then reinstated over subsequent decades in response to changing energy policy priorities. The United States, which had already been moving away from nuclear power following the 3 Mile Island accident of 1979, continued on that trajectory. The global construction of new nuclear power plants slowed dramatically in the late 1980s and 1990s. The RBMK reactors that were still operating in the Soviet Union were modified following the accident. The graphite-tipped control rods were redesigned to eliminate the positive void coefficient problem in the early moments of insertion. The operating procedures for the reactors were changed. The training of operators was revised. The culture of the Soviet nuclear industry, the culture that had suppressed safety concerns and managed information for political purposes, was at least partially reformed in the years following Chernobyl, though the extent and durability of that reform is disputed. Several of the Chernobyl plant's other reactors continued operating after the accident, a fact that strikes many people as extraordinary given what had happened. Reactor number 1, reactor number 2, and reactor number 3 continued to generate electricity for years after April of 1986. The last of them, reactor number 3, was shut down in December of the year 2000, 14 years after the accident, under pressure from the European Union and in exchange for financial assistance for Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The workers who operated these reactors in the years after the accident worked at a plant where the destroyed 4th unit was visible from the windows of their control rooms, sealed inside its sarcophagus, a constant and immediate reminder of what the reactor they were operating was capable of doing. The specific night of April the 25th and 26th, 1986, the night the test began, the night Toptunov pressed the AZ-5 button, the night the reactor exploded, happened in a specific place with specific people making specific decisions under specific pressures. The decisions that contributed to the accident were made by individuals, by Dyatlov, who ordered the test to proceed despite the conditions that made it dangerous, by the plant director Bryukhanov, who reported the accident in minimized terms that shaped the response in the critical first hours, by the designers of the RBMK, who built a reactor with dangerous characteristics and did not disclose those characteristics fully to the people who operated it, by the officials who received the safety reviews identifying the RBMK's problems and decided, for reasons of schedule and cost and institutional prestige, not to address them. But the accident was also a product of a system in which safety information was suppressed rather than shared, in which the career consequences of raising safety concerns outweighed the career consequences of ignoring them, in which the pressure to meet production targets and schedule commitments systematically displaced the pressure to operate safely, in which the culture of the organization made it rational, from an individual career perspective, to make the choices that Dyatlov and Bryukhanov and the others made. The individuals made choices that contributed to the accident. The system made those choices feel rational. This is the part of the Chernobyl story that is most important for understanding what happened and for taking from it whatever lessons it has to offer. The accident was not caused by the incompetence of its operators. Akimov and Toptunov were qualified, experienced people doing their jobs in an environment that gave them incomplete information and systematic incentives to minimize rather than escalate. The accident was not caused by the malice of Dyatlov. He was a difficult man who made bad decisions, but the bad decisions he made were the decisions that the system had trained him to make, the decisions that the system rewarded and did not punish. The accident was not even caused primarily by the design flaws in the RBMK. Those flaws were known, and they could have been corrected, and the fact that they were not corrected was a failure of the system that had the responsibility and the capability to correct them. The accident was caused by the accumulation of systemic failures in safety culture, in information management, in the relationship between technical expertise and political pressure that the Soviet nuclear industry had been building for years. Chernobyl was where those failures became visible. It was not where they began. The reactor burns still in its sealed enclosure. The corium sits in the basement. The exclusion zone's forests grow through the empty houses. The Ferris wheel in Pripyat's fairground stands where it stood on April the 25th, 1986, still waiting for the children who were supposed to ride it on the May Day holiday that was 5 days away when the reactor exploded. The city is empty. The spring comes every year to the empty streets. The trees grow through the floors of the classrooms where the children used to learn. The dosimeters of the tourists who visit click quietly in the April air, registering the background radiation that is the last physical trace of the most consequential nuclear accident in history. And somewhere beneath the new steel arch, in the sealed rooms of the reactor building, the material that was once the core of reactor number 4 continues its slow decay. Will continue it for decades, for centuries, for longer than any human institution is likely to last. The physical residue of the night when the test began and the graphite tips descended, and the power rose and the world learned something new about what nuclear technology was capable of, in the wrong hands, in the wrong conditions, in a system that had decided to pretend otherwise. The reactor burns still in its sealed enclosure. The corium sits in the basement. The exclusion zone's forests grow through the empty houses. The Ferris wheel in Pripyat's fairground stands where it stood on April the 25th, 1986, still waiting for the children who were supposed to ride it on the May Day holiday that was 5 days away when the reactor exploded. But the story of Chernobyl is not only the story of the reactor and the explosion and the evacuation and the containment. It is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, the story of the people who lived inside that night, who made it, who suffered it, who survived it, who carried it with them in the years that followed. Those stories did not end when the sarcophagus was sealed. They continued for decades in the hospitals and the relocated towns and the apartments of Moscow and Kiev and the other cities where the displaced people of the Chernobyl zone settled, and they are still continuing today in the lives of the people who were children in Pripyat in April of 1986 and who are now approaching 60. Lyudmila Ignatenko was 23 years old on the night of the explosion. She lived with her husband Vasil in a small apartment in Pripyat, the apartment that the fire brigade had assigned to them after their marriage, a place she had furnished carefully with the objects that mattered to her, that she had made into the first real home of their life together. Vasil was a firefighter stationed at the Chernobyl plant's fire brigade, and Lyudmila was pregnant with their first child, in the 5th month, the time when she had begun to feel the baby move. On the night of April the 25th, she was asleep when the explosion occurred. She was awakened, she later said, not by the sound of the explosion itself. Pripyat was 4 kilometers from the plant, and the explosion, while heard by some residents, was muffled by the distance, but by something she described as a change in the quality of the darkness. A light had appeared in the direction of the plant, a glow she could see through the window, that was not fire exactly, but something she could not name. She got up and looked out and saw the glow and thought, "There is a fire at the plant." Her husband was a firefighter. Fires were what her husband did. She went back to sleep. At 6 in the morning, a neighbour knocked on her door. Her husband had not come home. He was in the hospital in Pripyat. She went to the hospital, and she found him there among the other firefighters who had worked on the roof of the reactor building in the first hours after the explosion. He was already showing the early symptoms of radiation syndrome. Nausea. He was vomiting. His face was flushed with a redness that looked like a sunburn. He was 25 years old. He looked, she said, not sick, but somehow damaged, as if something had gone wrong inside him that she could not see. The doctors at the Pripyat hospital stabilized the most severely affected of the firefighters and arranged their transfer to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, the specialized clinic for radiation medicine that was the Soviet Union's center for treating acute radiation syndrome. Lyudmila wanted to go with Vasil. She was told that she could not, that only medical personnel could accompany the patients. She followed anyway, boarding a train to Moscow with several other wives of the hospitalized firefighters, arriving in Moscow and refusing to leave the hospital until they were allowed to see their husbands. What she witnessed in Hospital No. 6 over the weeks that followed is among the most harrowing accounts to emerge from the Chernobyl disaster. She has told it many times in interviews and in the oral history that forms the basis of Svetlana Alexievich's book, Voices from Chernobyl, told it with a specificity and a composure that suggest a person who has spent decades trying to make the experience comprehensible to herself and to others. The account describes the progressive physical deterioration of a man dying of radiation syndrome, the burns on the skin that were different from ordinary burns, that came from inside, that caused the skin to peel away in large sections as the cells died, the swelling, the bleeding from internal organs that appeared as blood in the urine and the saliva, the destruction of the immune system that left the body unable to fight any infection. The way a person who is dying of radiation syndrome does not look like a person who is dying of an ordinary illness, but like a person who is being consumed from the inside by something that has no analogy in ordinary experience. Vasil Ignatenko died on May the 13th, 1986, 17 days after the explosion. He was 25 years old. The baby Lyudmila was carrying, a daughter, who died 4 hours after birth from congenital heart defects and liver disease attributed to her radiation exposure in utero, died on August the 22nd. Lyudmila survived. She has given interviews about her experience for the 4 decades since, bearing witness to what happened with a steadiness that seems to come from the conviction that Vasil's death and the deaths of the other firefighters must be understood and remembered if they are to mean anything. She remarried. She had more children. She continued to speak about what she had witnessed, because she believed that speaking about it was necessary, that the world needed to know what had happened to the young men who had gone onto the roof of the reactor building in the dark, not knowing what they were walking into, with their ordinary firefighting equipment and their ordinary courage, and had met something that their training and their equipment and their courage were not sufficient to survive. The trial of the officials responsible for the Chernobyl accident took place in July of 1987, approximately 14 months after the explosion, in the town of Chernobyl itself, not in Moscow or Kiev, but in the town whose name the station bore, in a courtroom that had been set up specifically for the proceedings. The defendants were 6: Viktor Bryukhanov, the plant director, Nikolai Fomin, the plant's chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer for operations who had supervised the test, Boris Rogozhin, the chief of the reactor shop, Alexander Kovalenko, the senior reactor control operator on the shift that had been responsible for the power reduction in the hours before the test, and Yuri Laushkin, an inspector from the Soviet Nuclear Regulatory Authority. The charges were violations of safety regulations, not manslaughter, not criminal negligence in the sense that Western legal systems might frame it, but the Soviet legal category that most closely applied to what the prosecution argued had happened. The trial was, by the standards of Soviet legal proceedings, relatively transparent. Foreign correspondents were allowed to observe, and the proceedings were reported in the Soviet press. The defendants were allowed to mount defences, and several of them argued, with some justification, that the accident was not simply the product of their individual failures, but of systemic problems in the Soviet nuclear industry, for which responsibility was more widely distributed than the charges implied. Dyatlov, in particular, argued vigorously throughout the trial that the accident had been caused by the RBMK's design flaws, specifically the graphite-tipped control rods and the positive void coefficient, and not by his decisions. His argument was not without merit. The RBMK design flaws had contributed to the accident in a fundamental way, and the designers of the reactor, who were not in the dock at Chernobyl, bore a significant share of the responsibility for what had happened. But Dyatlov's argument also obscured the extent to which his own decisions to proceed with the test despite the reactor being in a dangerous operating condition, to dismiss the concerns of his subordinates, to create an atmosphere in which safety considerations were subordinated to schedule pressures, had contributed to the circumstances that made the design flaws fatal. All 6 defendants were convicted. Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov were each sentenced to 10 years in a labour camp, the maximum penalty available under the charges. The other 3 received shorter sentences. The sentences were not fully served. Fomin, who suffered a mental breakdown during his imprisonment, was released after serving a few years on health grounds. Dyatlov was released in 1990, after serving approximately 3 years, also on health grounds. He had been significantly irradiated during the accident and its aftermath, and the radiation exposure had damaged his health in ways that became progressively more serious during his imprisonment. He died in 1995 of heart failure attributed in part to his radiation exposure. Bryukhanov served his sentence and was released in 1991. He was 60 years old, in poor health, and returned to Kiev, where he lived in relative obscurity until his death in 2021 at the age of 85. In various interviews he gave in the years after his release, he maintained that his reports to Moscow in the hours following the accident had been accurate given the information available to him at the time, that he had reported what he knew, and that what he knew was limited by the same confusion and misunderstanding that affected everyone in the first hours. Whether this account is self-serving or accurate is a question that the available evidence does not definitively resolve. The trial and its verdicts were, from the perspective of the families of those who had died, unsatisfying, not because the sentences were too light, necessarily, but because the proceedings focused on the individuals in the dock, while the systemic failures that had made those individuals' decisions so consequential remained largely unaddressed. The designers of the RBMK were not tried. The officials who had received the safety review identifying the graphite-tipped control rod problem in 1983 and had not ensured it was corrected were not tried. The culture of an industry in which safety concerns were suppressed for political and economic reasons was not on trial. 6 men were tried, and 6 men were convicted, and the trial was over, and the systemic problems that had produced the accident continued to exist in various forms in Soviet and then Russian nuclear institutions for years. The health consequences of the Chernobyl accident for the populations of Ukraine and Belarus, the populations who lived downwind of the contaminated plume, who drank contaminated water and milk and ate contaminated food in the weeks and months after the explosion, have been the subject of extensive study and persistent controversy for 4 decades. The controversy has a specific structure. On one side are those who argue that the health effects of the accident, beyond the immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome, and the clear increase in thyroid cancer among children who were exposed to radioactive iodine in the weeks after the accident, are difficult to distinguish from background rates of disease and may be smaller than the political and public discourse around Chernobyl suggests. On the other side are those who argue that the studies have systematically underestimated the health burden of the accident, both because of methodological limitations and because of political pressures, from the Soviet and then Russian governments, from the nuclear industry, and from international organizations with interests in not overstating the risks of nuclear power, to produce results that minimize the apparent impact. The specific case of thyroid cancer is the clearest and least disputed. Radioactive iodine, iodine 131, with a half-life of 8 days, was released in large quantities from the burning reactor and was absorbed by people who drank contaminated milk and water in the days and weeks after the explosion. The thyroid gland concentrates iodine, and the thyroid glands of children in the affected areas absorb significant doses of radioactive iodine. In the years following the accident, rates of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents in Ukraine and Belarus and the affected areas of Russia rose dramatically, from extremely rare, essentially never seen in children of this age group, to rates that were orders of magnitude above background. By the late 1990s, approximately 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer in people who had been children at the time of the accident had been documented, the vast majority attributable to the radiation exposure. The thyroid cancer caused by Chernobyl was, in most cases, treatable. The survival rate was high, around 98%, but the treatment required surgery and lifelong hormone replacement, and the experience of being diagnosed with cancer in childhood or early adulthood, of undergoing surgery and medical monitoring that would continue for the rest of one's life, was itself a significant burden. The situation regarding other cancers and other health effects is less clear. The studies of leukemia, which is among the most radiation-sensitive of cancers and would be expected to appear relatively soon after exposure, have produced results that are inconsistent and difficult to interpret. Some studies have found elevated rates in the most heavily exposed populations, others have not. The overall cancer burden attributable to Chernobyl, beyond the thyroid cancer cases, remains genuinely uncertain, disputed in the scientific literature, and likely to remain disputed for decades given the methodological challenges of separating radiation-induced cancers from the background rate of cancer in a large population. The psychological health consequences of the accident are, in some respects, more clearly documented and more severe than the radiological health consequences. The populations most affected by the accident, the evacuees from the exclusion zone, the liquidators, the people living in the most contaminated areas, showed elevated rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and health anxiety in the studies conducted in the years after the accident. The causes of this psychological burden were multiple: the direct trauma of the explosion and the evacuation, the loss of homes and communities and livelihoods, the uncertainty about health consequences and the fear of cancer that would persist for the rest of their lives, and the specific social stigma that attached to people from the Chernobyl area, the reluctance of employers to hire liquidators, the reluctance of prospective partners to marry people from the contaminated zones, the sense of being marked by an invisible contamination that others found threatening. The stigma was real, and its effects were real. Studies conducted in the 1990s and 2000s found that the populations most affected by Chernobyl reported significantly worse self-assessed health than populations with comparable actual health status, that people from the Chernobyl area believed themselves to be sicker than they actually were, in the measurable physical sense, and that this belief had its own consequences for their functioning and their well-being. The fear of radiation and its consequences was itself a source of harm, independent of the radiation's direct physical effects. This finding, that the psychological harm of a nuclear accident extends far beyond its physical harm, and may in many cases exceed it, has influenced how the international public health community thinks about nuclear accidents and about how to communicate the risks of radiation to populations affected by such accidents. The lesson, stated simply, is that accurate information matters enormously, that populations who understand what has actually happened to them, who know the actual risks they face rather than being told nothing or being told comforting inaccuracies, cope better than populations who are left to construct their own understanding from rumor and worst-case assumption. The Soviet management of information in the days and weeks after Chernobyl, the minimization, the denial, the 36-hour delay before the evacuation had direct physical consequences in the form of additional radiation exposure. It also had lasting psychological consequences in the form of a population that was left with a justified distrust of official information about radiation and its effects, a distrust that persisted for decades and that complicated subsequent efforts to communicate accurately about the health situation in the affected areas. The children of Pripyat are not children anymore. The people who were born in or moved to the young city on the Pripyat River in the years before the accident, who grew up in its apartments and went to its schools and played in its parks, are now in their 50s and 60s. They are distributed across Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and the other countries of the former Soviet Union and beyond, and they carry with them the specific identity of a place that no longer exists, the identity of Pripyat, the city that was. Some of them have maintained contact with each other through organizations and social networks that formed in the years after the evacuation, and that have persisted in various forms through the decades. The bonds formed in the city, friendships, marriages, professional relationships, maintained themselves across the dispersal, renewed and sustained at the gatherings that the former residents have organized periodically in the years since the evacuation. There is a particular intensity to the attachment that the former residents of Pripyat feel for their city, an intensity that is partly explained by the specific circumstances of the evacuation, which was sudden and complete and definitively ended any possibility of return. But that also reflects something about the character of Pripyat itself, which was a young city in a way that gave it a particular social energy and cohesion. Some of them have returned to visit, as tourists in the exclusion zone, organized tours that began in the years after Ukrainian independence and that expanded significantly following the release of the HBO miniseries Chernobyl in 2019, which brought a new wave of international attention and tourism to the site. The visitors who walk through the empty streets of Pripyat today, past the collapsed apartment blocks and the overgrown playground equipment, and the school with its scattered books and the hospital with its still contaminated equipment, include former residents for whom the tour is something different from what it is for the first-time visitors. Not discovery, but reunion with a ghost. The experience of returning to an abandoned version of a place you loved is a specific and particular kind of grief. The former residents who have described it say that Pripyat looks simultaneously familiar and completely strange, that the geography is recognizable, the streets are in the right places, the buildings are where they were, but the life that filled those streets and those buildings is utterly absent, replaced by decades of vegetation and decay that have transformed the human environment into something between ruin and forest. The apartment blocks they lived in still contain, in many cases, the furniture and the personal objects that were left behind in the evacuation, the books on the shelves, the clothing in the wardrobes, the children's toys, the family photographs. These objects, undisturbed for nearly 4 decades, are the record of the moment when the city's life stopped. The school gymnasium at School Number 1 in Pripyat contains gas masks, hundreds of them, spread across the floor in various states of decay. No one knows who put them there or why. The gas masks were part of the school's emergency preparedness supplies, and they may have been brought out during the evacuation and discarded when it became clear they were not useful, or they may have been placed there by someone in the years since the evacuation for reasons that are not recorded. They are one of the iconic images of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, reproduced in thousands of photographs and documentary films, and they capture something about the specific quality of the abandonment, the ordinary objects of a world that was preparing for one kind of disaster, scattered by a different kind of disaster that the preparation was not designed for. The Chernobyl disaster occurred 38 years ago. The people who are adults today, who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, grew up in a world that already knew about Chernobyl, that had absorbed the accident as part of its background understanding of nuclear technology and its risks. For those people, Chernobyl is history, a past event with a clear narrative and a defined cast of characters, and a set of lessons that have been drawn and drawn again in the decades since. For the people who were adults in 1986, who were in their 20s and 30s and 40s when the reactor exploded, who lived in Pripyat or worked at the plant, or were among the liquidators, or were the parents of children in the thyroid cancer studies, it is something different. It is not history in the sense of a past that has been resolved and placed at a safe distance. It is the event around which a substantial portion of their lives has been organized, the reference point from which before and after are measured. The thing that happened and that continued happening for years, and that in some cases is still happening now, in the form of the health consequences they are living with, or the communities they lost, or the futures that were redirected by the accident, and its aftermath. The word Chernobyl has come to carry a weight in the language, in Russian, in Ukrainian, in English and German and Japanese, and every language in which nuclear power is a political issue that is disproportionate to the actual scale of the accident in some respects, and entirely proportionate in others. The disproportionate part is the gap between the public perception of Chernobyl as a catastrophe of incalculable scale and the measured reality of its health effects, which, while real and significant, are considerably less than the worst-case estimates that circulated in the years after the accident suggested. The proportionate part is the recognition that Chernobyl represented something genuinely new, not just a large accident, but a demonstration that nuclear technology, in the wrong circumstances, could produce consequences that were beyond the capacity of any single institution or government to manage cleanly, that could contaminate land and displace populations on a scale that had no precedent in the history of industrial accidents. The specific lesson that Chernobyl offers, the lesson that its investigators and its survivors and its observers have drawn most consistently, is the lesson about safety culture and about the relationship between the systems that human beings build and the human beings who build and operate them. The RBMK's design flaws were known. The risks of operating the reactor in certain conditions were known. The problems with the control rod design were known. What was not known, or rather what was systematically prevented from being acted upon, was the implications of those known problems for the safety of the people operating the reactor and the people living in its vicinity. A safety culture is a culture in which the people who operate complex and dangerous systems are encouraged, structurally rewarded, and individually empowered to raise safety concerns, to stop operations when they believe something is wrong, and to share information about near misses and potential problems with the wider community of people who operate similar systems. The Soviet nuclear industry in 1986 did not have this kind of safety culture. It had the opposite, a culture in which safety concerns were subordinated to production targets, in which the career consequences of stopping an operation or raising an alarm were borne by the person who stopped or raised, and not by the system that created the unsafe condition, in which the information about problems and near misses was classified rather than shared. The culture that produced Chernobyl did not die with the Soviet Union. It has reappeared in various forms in various industries and various countries in the decades since, in the organizational culture of the Space Shuttle program, whose own catastrophic failure 7 months before Chernobyl, the Challenger disaster, January 28, 1986, demonstrated many of the same dynamics, in the financial industry cultures that produced the crisis of 2008, in various other settings where the pressure to continue operations and meet targets has overridden the signals that something was dangerously wrong. Chernobyl is, in this sense, not just a story about nuclear power or about the Soviet Union. It is a story about the specific and recurring failure mode of large institutions operating complex systems under political and economic pressure. The failure mode in which the information that would allow the system to recognize and correct its own dangerous conditions is suppressed, distorted, or ignored until the conditions produce consequences that can no longer be managed. On April the 26th each year, in Ukraine, there is a day of remembrance for the victims of the Chernobyl accident. Memorial services are held at the site and in cities across the country. The names of those who died from acute radiation syndrome are read aloud. Candles are lit. The survivors and the relatives of those who did not survive gather in the places that were meaningful to them and mark another year. In the exclusion zone, the Day of Remembrance brings a particular kind of gathering. The former residents who return once a year, as they are permitted to do, to visit the homes and the churches and the cemeteries of the area they were removed from. There are still a small number of people, old women mostly, called the Samosli, the self-settlers, who refuse to leave the exclusion zone and who have remained in their villages in defiance of the evacuation orders and subsequent regulations for the nearly 4 decades since the accident. They are a diminishing group, Their numbers have declined from several hundred in the years after the evacuation to a few dozen today, as age and death have reduced the community, and they live in conditions that are difficult by most contemporary standards, without regular services or medical care, in villages whose other residents left decades ago. They grow their own food, keep their own animals, and when asked why they have stayed, they give answers that vary in their specifics, but that share a common underlying logic: that the place you are from is where you belong, and that the risks of radiation in the place you are from are less threatening than the certain loss of the place itself. The radiation levels in the parts of the exclusion zone where the self-settlers live are, in most areas, not dramatically different from background radiation levels in other parts of Europe. The contamination is real, and it is present in the soil and the vegetation, and people who eat food grown there are incorporating that contamination into their bodies. But the doses are modest by the standards of what constitutes a significant health risk, and the studies of the self-settlers' health have not found dramatically worse outcomes than comparable populations outside the zone, which suggests that the radiation levels in the inhabited parts of the zone, while above normal background, are not at levels that produce dramatic acute effects in adults. The self-settlers are, in a sense, a living demonstration of the gap between the perceived danger of the exclusion zone and its actual measured risk, though this observation should not be taken as a dismissal of the real contamination that exists in the zone, which is real and uneven and would require careful monitoring for any population considering return. The question of whether and when it might be possible to allow controlled resettlement of parts of the exclusion zone has been discussed at intervals in the years since the accident and remains unresolved. The Ukrainian government has at various times expressed interest in the question, as the exclusion zone represents a significant amount of land that is, in its physical characteristics, suitable for habitation. The forests and wetlands of Polesia are not a wasteland. They are a landscape of considerable ecological richness, and the agricultural land of the zone, while contaminated in places, is in other places at radiation levels that careful management could potentially make safe for food production. The new safe confinement, which was completed in 2016, has stabilized the situation at the plant site and reduced the ongoing radioactive release from the destroyed reactor to negligible levels, removing one of the primary barriers to considering resettlement of the surrounding area. But the barriers are not only radiological, they are also social and political and psychological, the product of nearly 4 decades during which the exclusion zone has been defined, legally and culturally, as a place of danger and exclusion, and during which the populations who lived there have built new lives elsewhere, and the question of return has become, for most of them, a question about the past rather than the future. The community that was Pripyat and the other communities of the zone existed in a specific time and a specific social context, and the passage of 4 decades has changed both the people and the context in ways that make simple return impossible, even if the physical conditions of the zone permitted it. What was lost at Chernobyl was not only contaminated, and what was contaminated cannot simply be decontaminated and returned. In the spring of 2022, 36 years after the accident, Russian military forces invading Ukraine passed through the Chernobyl exclusion zone as part of their assault on Kiev. The forces occupied the Chernobyl plant site and the surrounding territory for approximately a month before withdrawing in late March of 2022. During the occupation, Russian soldiers dug trenches in the Red Forest, the area adjacent to the plant that was so heavily contaminated during the accident that the pine trees turned red and died, and that remains among the most contaminated patches of land on Earth. The digging disturbed the contaminated soil, raising radioactive dust that the soldiers breathed. Several Russian soldiers were subsequently reported to have been hospitalized for radiation exposure. The Russian military's passage through the exclusion zone was, in the context of the larger horror of the invasion, a relatively minor incident. But it had a particular symbolic weight: the image of soldiers disturbing the Red Forest, of armoured vehicles moving through the streets of Pripyat, of the exclusion zone that had been maintained for 36 years as a monument to the consequences of a particular kind of catastrophic failure, being violated by a new and different catastrophic failure. That was not lost on those who had been paying attention to Chernobyl and to Ukraine for the 4 decades since the accident. The Chernobyl plant, the exclusion zone, the ghost city of Pripyat, These places exist today at the intersection of two histories: the history of the nuclear accident and its consequences, and the history of Ukraine as an independent country asserting its existence against forces that have sought to deny or subordinate it. The Chernobyl disaster happened to Soviet Ukraine, and its management was conducted by Soviet institutions for Soviet political purposes. Its consequences were borne primarily by the Ukrainian and Belarusian peoples who lived in the affected areas. The independent Ukraine that emerged from the Soviet collapse in 1991 inherited the disaster along with everything else: the contaminated land, the displaced populations, the health burden, the decommissioning responsibilities that the Ukrainian state was left with when the Soviet institutions that had managed the disaster dissolved. Ukraine has managed these responsibilities with the international support that the scale of the task required, but it has managed them. The new safe confinement that covers the destroyed reactor was built with international funding, coordinated through Ukraine, and its construction was a Ukrainian-managed project. The exclusion zone has become, under Ukrainian management, a significant site of memory and science and cautious tourism, maintained and monitored in ways that reflect the values of an independent state that takes its relationship with this piece of its history seriously. The Russian occupation of the exclusion zone in 2022 was an act of indifference to all of that, an indifference to the history of the place, to the scientific and memorial work that had been ongoing there, and to the basic precautions that the contamination of the land required. The soldiers who dug in the Red Forest did not know they were digging in the Red Forest, or did not care. The indifference was of a piece with the larger indifference to Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian life that characterized the invasion. The Ferris wheel in Pripyat's fairground has never turned. It was installed in April of 1986, in the week before the accident, in preparation for the May Day holiday that would have been the occasion of its first use. The accident intervened, and the holiday was cancelled, and the city was evacuated, and the Ferris wheel stood in its fairground as the city emptied around it, and the vegetation grew up around its base, and the decades passed. It is one of the most photographed objects in the world, certainly one of the most photographed objects in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Photographers from all over the world have made the journey to stand in the empty fairground and point their cameras at the motionless wheel against the sky. The photographs are beautiful in the way that abandoned things are often beautiful. The beauty of the object's persistence in the absence of its purpose. The pathos of the fairground equipment waiting for the children who have not come. The Ferris wheel is rusting. The gondolas that hang from it are deteriorating. In the coming decades, without maintenance, it will eventually collapse. The metal will fail, the bearings will seize, the structure will give way to gravity and weather. When it falls, it will not be rebuilt. There are no children to come. The night of April the 25th and 26th, 1986, was a specific night with specific people in a specific place making specific decisions. Toptonov pressed the button at 1:23 and 40 seconds, and the graphite tips descended into the channels, and the power rose, and the world changed. The changes were physical. In the landscape, in the bodies of the people who were exposed, in the political trajectory of the Soviet state. They were also something harder to name, a change in the human understanding of what technology could do, of the gap between a system's stated safety and its actual safety, of the difference between the official account of the night and the account that would eventually emerge from the testimony of those who were there. The official account said the reactor was intact. The reactor was not intact. The official account said radiation levels were manageable. They were not manageable. The official account said the evacuation was precautionary and temporary. It was not temporary. The gap between the official account and the truth, the gap that was the product of a system that had learned to suppress inconvenient truths for decades, was itself one of the most significant things that Chernobyl produced. Not only the radiation, not only the deaths, not only the displaced populations and the contaminated land, but the revelation of what it looks like when a system that has been lying to itself for a long time encounters a truth too large to manage. Chernobyl was where the Soviet system's long practice of managed reality encountered an unmanageable reality, and the collision was visible to the entire world. The exclusion zone is still there. The reactor is still sealed. Under its steel arch, with its corium still generating heat from the decay of fission products, will continue to generate heat for decades. The Ferris wheel is still there. The spring comes every year to the empty streets of Pripyat, and the trees push a little further through the floors of the apartments, and the objects left behind by the evacuees age quietly in the empty rooms, and the dosimeters click. And on the 26th of April, every year, people gather to say the names of those who died, and to stand in the place where it happened, and to hold in their minds the specific and irreducible fact of what one night in one place changed. Not for the better, not for the worse in the simple ways that catastrophes usually make things worse, but in the complicated and lasting way of an event that revealed something true about the world that had not been visible before, and that cannot be made invisible again. The names, the night, the light above the reactor that was not fire, the Ferris wheel, the spring,